Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I will be reviewing Season 1 of Les Petits Meurtres d'Agatha Christie and the preceding miniseries Petits Meurtres en Famille. I've watched pretty much every English language Christie adaptation possible, and I've been wanting to get into more foreign language adaptations, especially this series. I believe the only foreign language adaptation I've watched is the Japanese anime series Great Detectives Poirot and Marple, which was very good, and this series is excellent. It's even better. And I do have like a basic knowledge of the French language, but I'm pretty sure my pronunciation isn't as good as it was in college when I took French like 10 years ago. And if you want to watch this series, at least in the US, I watched it on Amazon Prime. You have to subscribe to a channel for like $7.99 a month, and you get a week's free trial, which I managed to squeeze the entire first season and the miniseries in before my trial expired. I only watched those, so I have to resubscribe to watch seasons 2 and 3, which I will cover in the future sometime. And I will not be directly spoiling these episodes, but I may refer to things that could be interpreted as spoilers, especially for the novels, but I will not directly spoil the solutions to either the books or the episodes without a fair warning. Now, not all the episodes have the same conclusion as the books do, so that's also another reason why I won't spoil. But before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. We're almost at 400 viewers, so almost halfway there to 1,000. I'll start with the series overview, and I should begin by saying that the mini-series Petits Meurtres en Famille, which means The Little Murders in the Family but has the English title of Agatha Christie's Family Murder Party, aired in 2006 and led to the creation of the main series Les Petits Meurtres d'Agatha Christie, which means The Little Murders of Agatha Christie. However, the main series is considered separate from the miniseries. They do share the main characters, but not a canon, and that will make sense if you've watched both. The first season of Les Petits Meurtres features Jean Lerossier and his new police inspector Emile Lampion. The same actors played the same characters in the original miniseries as well. There are different characters for season 2, and yet more different characters for season 3. But Lerossier and Lampion are the stars here. There is no Poirot, there is no Marple, there is no any main sleuth from a Christie novel. And what this series does is a bit different than most adaptations. For the most part, these are not direct adaptations of novels. Some are closer to the novels than others, but what this series does is take the basic skeleton of Christie's murder plots and works from there to create a semi-original story. The episodes often use similar clues, they have parallel characters, but they are twisting things around. For instance, it may keep a clue from the novel, but use it in a different way. They may take different directions with different characters, but I was never bothered by any of this. This series is fantastic in what it does. I never felt like the original works were being disrespected in any way. When things go on a different path, I always felt it worked, and I always felt it was in keeping with the spirit of the original novel. These episodes are based on the original novels. They are not direct adaptations, mostly. Season 1 is set entirely in the 1930s in the northern French city of Lille and the surrounding area, and this time and place setting influences a lot of the plot. For instance, the method of execution used is the guillotine, not hanging, so the guillotine looms large over the events. There's a heavy Catholic presence, not Anglican. I found the production value of these episodes to be top notch. The acting, the costumes, the writing, the sets, it was all fantastic. I really can't recommend this series enough. Now, the series is a bit more adult than the typical adaptation. It is a French production, so there are different cultural standards. The series has a lot of sex, nudity, foul language, violence. I wouldn't say it's gory, but there's a little bit more blood than maybe you might be expecting. It's just something to be aware of, but I was not particularly bothered by any of this. Our main character for season 1 is Commissaire Jean Lerossier, played by Antoine Dulery. There is a lot of Hercule Poirot and Larossiere, especially regarding some of his methods and his treatment toward Lampion, which reminded me a lot of Poirot and Hastings. But he's also very different from Poirot. The main thing being that Larossiere is a huge womanizer. He falls in love with a lot of women, especially women who are major suspects. He likes to do a lot of his thinking on the toilet, that gets mentioned a lot. I also noticed a little bit of Nero Wolfe in Larossiere as well. Of course, his womanizing is more like Archie Goodwin, but I enjoyed him a lot. Like I said, he was a little Poirot-esque, but I also thought he had his own unique personality and methods. He wasn't just like some kind of like Poirot ripoff. His assistant and our other main character for season one is Inspector Emile Lampion, played by Marius Colucci. In the mini-series, Lampion is brand new to the police force, but by the time of the main series, he is already a full-fledged inspector. He's very Captain Hastings coded, but again, he has his own personality as well. He's a lot smarter than Hastings. Lampion actually solves some of these cases by himself, or like with Larossiere. He's not an idiot, but he does have that like nervous newbie vibe going on. He looks up to Larossiere because they both lost their fathers. Specifically, they were both abandoned by their fathers. And Lampion is gay, which is a secret because this is the 1930s, although Larossiere knows, as do like pretty much everyone he encounters, even though this is like supposed to be a secret. And boy, is his sexuality mentioned a lot, often for jokes. And although he's kind of shy and nerdy, Lampion does like hook up with quite a few men throughout season one. I also enjoyed Lampion quite a bit. These are two good characters. I enjoyed the interplay between them, and this was a lot like Poirot and Hastings, but also had its own unique dynamic as well. And let's get into the episodes. Season 1 had 11 episodes. And if you watch these on Amazon, the episodes are like all out of order and disorganized, but I'm going to present them in the order they aired. And I'm also starting with the main series, Season 1, before the mini-series, because that's the order I watched them in. And I think there's a lot more interesting way to watch them. The first episode was Les Meurtres ABC, the ABC Murders. And this one is largely faithful to the book in terms of mechanics and plot. The biggest difference is that there is no Alice Asher murder. The Betty Barnard murder is now the A murder. The B murder is a new one of a vagrant. And the C murder is still the Clark murder. And I also should let you know that when I'm talking about characters, I'm going to use the names from the books just for clarity's sake. The characters have different names in the series. And I enjoyed this episode a lot. It was a good story to pick for the pilot episode to get to know the characters and get used to like what the series does. One thing that bothered me about this episode was that it was only the first names that went alphabetically. It wasn't like A, B, B, etc. And you could tell the writers love to play around with our expectations. The writers assume the viewers are familiar with the books and the other adaptations, and they do like to play with that. Episode 2 is called Amstramgram, which I believe means eeny, meeny, miny, mo, but this is an adaptation of Ordeal by Innocence, and I think this is the very clear best adaptation of this novel. This novel has been adapted many times, and many times poorly. This is the exception. It's extremely faithful to the novel, and what changes for the better. The most important change for me is that the Arthur Calgary character, his name is Aristide Pepin, only shows up to make the claim that Jacko is innocent, and then he disappears. We don't have to deal with him like we do in the book, and it's for the best. The investigation is conducted by Lampion et Larossiere, who arrested Jacko years ago. Jacko is murdered in prison because he was apparently scamming his fellow inmates. He is not hanged or beheaded like in some adaptations, or died naturally like in the book. Lampion falls pretty hard for the Mickey character here, while Larossiere falls for the Hester parallel. And this adaptation probably trends closest to the original novel than any other episode. There is an attempt on Kirsten's life, and there's another new victim in Rose, who is the parallel to Jacko's wife, Maureen. She plays a larger role here than in the book, but other than that, this episode is extremely faithful, and I thought expertly executed. Episode 3, and after the first 2 episodes, we do start to see more movement in what I described earlier. Less faithfulness to the original novel, but still using the basic skeleton of the plot and characters in an original but still recognizable way. I was never angry by changes made. Episode 3 is called La Plume Empoisonnée, or The Poison Pen, and this is The Moving Finger. There's no Miss Marple. There's no Burton siblings. The story begins with Lampion being shot in the course of his duties, and he and Laurassier go to the countryside for his recovery, where they find themselves in the midst of the poison pen stuff. This episode and future ones have a lot of like Three's Company moments where like people walk in on Lampion and Laurassier in like compromising situations, only to be like completely misinterpret what is going on. You know, the Miss Barton equivalent is obsessed with gay men, and she won't rent her house until she's sure the two policemen are not a couple, and she's like obsessed with gay men. So naturally, Laurassier and Lampion receive a poison pen later, claiming just that. And because we're in Catholic France, the Dane Calthrops are now mother and son, with the son being a priest. Megan's parents are just outright hate her. You know, in the book, it's more like neglect than anything, but here it's like outright hate. I mean, they just tell her to her face that they hate her. And we have the same victims as we do in the novel, but we also have new ones as well. And it's all keeping up in the spirit of the moving finger. And, you know, some of the letters that people receive in this episode are just, like, outright foul, like, much worse than they do in the book. You know, there's nothing that made my eyes roll here. You know, I enjoyed this episode a lot. It was overly funny at times. This is probably, like, the funniest episode. Maybe there's one or two others that could beat it, but this was a pretty good episode as well. Episode 4 is called La Maison du Péril, The House of Peril, which is Peril at End House. And I actually thought this was one of the weaker episodes, although I thought it was still pretty good. You know, the basic plot is all there, but a lot of the characters don't have novel equivalents. You can sort of see some parallels. You know, unfortunately, in my opinion, a lot of those like very fun clues from the book have been dispensed with. In particular, the naming clue, which is a shame. You know, all the extra subplots like the drug smuggling are dispensed with. The missing will shenanigans with the Crofts or whatever, that's gone. You know, I still found the story good, but I think it was a letdown not seeing some of those like exquisite clues from the novel come back here, because those are some of my favorite parts of any Christie novel. You know, Laurassier naturally falls in love with the Nick Buckley character, who's named Josephine here. And this is somewhat textual. You know, Poirot is very clearly taken in by Nick in the book, and this plays off of that. Laurassier is madly in love with Josephine to the point that he has these, like, extremely erotic dreams about her. Meanwhile, Lampion, who was supposed to be on vacation, had his holiday rerouted to this case where he's forced to be a servant named Victor, which is so funny because he's so bad at it. Again, this was a good episode, but I did feel like it needed more like Peril at End House in it to truly enjoy it. I didn't necessarily feel they used everything they could from the novel in this story, but again, it was not a bad episode at all. Episode 5 is called Le Chat et les Souris, The Cat and the Mice, or as we know it, Cat Among the Pigeons. And the action takes place in a girls' Catholic school. Some of the teachers, most notably the Miss Chadwick character, are nuns, although most of them are not. You know, a lot of the characters are mixed up. We have clear equivalents, but they're all doing different things than they did in the book. A lot of characters have been, like, switched, if that makes sense. In order to get the main characters in on the action earlier, there is a new murder, it's technically not new, of a woman in the woods nearby the school that has like all the girls totally interested in this. And there are more students who are important to the plot. A lot of the twists and tricks of the novel are still there and they're still used, but they're used on different characters and in different manners. The Miss Bulstrode character is totally different. She is not at all a nice woman, and she is retiring because she's dying. You don't ever get the sense she or any other teacher at the school actually cares about the girls like they do in the novel. Julia Upjohn is now named Juliet, and she is actually Laurassier's daughter he did not know about until he showed up at this case. And her mother is actually the custodian at the school, and Juliet gets to attend classes as a courtesy, even though these like really snobby teachers don't want to educate the child of a servant. I enjoyed this episode. I think it does what adaptation should do. You're familiar with the story, and you can see that in the episode, but it also keeps you in suspense over the new material. You know, one of the fun things about this series is you never know if the outcome is going to be the same or not. Episode 6 is called Je ne suis pas coupable, or I Am Not Guilty, which is an adaptation of Sad Cypress. And this episode does a lot of actually what like the David Suchet Poirot series did with the book. It has the Eleanor character, her name is Claire, convicted of the two murders, sentenced to death by guillotine, and then there's a race against time to save her. Larassier and Lampion are brought in before the murders because the Peter Lord character, who is now a secretary to Laura Wellman, character, is worried something is going to happen. Lampion is forced to go undercover as a feminist author with Larassier as his husband, and this episode has a heavy feminist slash suffragette theme to it. I've always hated the murder mechanics of this book. They simply don't work, and I'm happy to say this episode completely dispenses with them in favor of something new. A lot of the information about the Mary Gerard character is learned in a different manner, and that makes more sense. This episode really cleared away a lot of the problems I have with the book and made it a much better product. Weirdly, we still get like the setup to the stolen morphine, even though that goes like absolutely nowhere. Like that plot has gone away. That was an odd and like uncharacteristic mistake from the series. Also weird was that the seance trick from Parallel End House that was omitted from that episode is used here. And if you read Parallel End House, you know what I'm talking about. But overall, this was a great episode and one that improved on the book significantly, in my opinion. Episode 7 is called Cinq Petits Cochons, Five Little Pigs. I think this is probably the weakest episode in the series. I thought the episode was fine. It wasn't bad, but it did away with a lot of what made the book special. I think the character work was both lacking and different in not an interesting way. It lacked that special something that makes the book so enticing. The way in is different. Lampion and Larassier get into a fight, and Lampion quits. He joins a private detective agency and is hired by the Carla Lemarchand character to investigate her father's death. The Caroline Crail equivalent is still alive, and she's been in prison this whole time. And to me, that just like already threw off the course of this episode. Lampion is forced to work with Larassier again because Larassier was the original detective on the Amias Crail case. So there's like an awkwardness between them, but of course they make up pretty quickly. The main downside for me here was the nursery rhyme. I find the nursery rhyme in the book to be tolerable. It's not great, but it's tolerable. I think it's weird, but fine. But here, it's even stranger. It's a completely different nursery rhyme. Like, I guess this nursery rhyme is just not popular in France or, like, doesn't exist in France or something. The Blake brothers have been merged into one character, with Caroline Crail becoming the fifth pig, really the first pig. That's another thing, too. Like, all the pigs are out of order. I think maybe this particular novel just, like, didn't fit in with the atmosphere of this season. They kept the murder mechanics and the plot largely intact. This series is overly humorous and ridiculous at times. It's over the top, and they go heavy in on adding like a lot of murders and attempted murders, and they didn't do that here. I think this episode, while certainly watchable and not bad, just like didn't live up to the rest of the series. Having Caroline Crail still alive, it sort of like did away with like, oh, she's finally at peace, she accepted it. It just totally off for me. It didn't work necessarily. Episode 8 is called Le Flux et le Reflux, The Ebb and the Tide, or Taken at the Flood. And I did not like the David Suchet adaptation of this novel, and I thought this one was better, but still not ideal. It too is set in the 1930s, which means we miss out on all that good post-World War II stuff. But it still keeps the idea that, the theme of one should seize the opportunity whenever it arises. So that automatically made it better than the Suchet one for me. The spirit of the novel is still there as much as possible, but this is one that loses something when you switch the time. And the in on this one is that Captain Delarive, who is the Gordon Claude parallel, was the commanding officer of Larassier during World War I, and they attend the same club as the Major Porter character. Captain Delarive dies in a fire with the servants, not a bombing, but the rest of the adaptation is largely faithful. They cut Kathy and Lionel Claude, and the Adela character is heavy into spiritualism. And for me, this episode had a very odd blocking that was noticeable because we're with the family at the beginning of the story. Captain Delarive is still alive, and the show goes to great lengths to avoid both the family and the viewer seeing Albertine, who is the Rosaline parallel in this episode. It's awkward, and you know something is up there, but overall, I thought this was a decent episode. One last note here: Albertine, that again, that's the Rosaline character, is played by Blandine Bellevoir, who plays one of the main characters, Alice Avril, in the second season. I haven't watched season two, so I'm not sure like how good she is, but she was a good actress in this episode at least. Episode 9 is called Un cadavre sur l'oreiller, the body on the pillow, or as we know it, the body in the library. And the reason why the title was changed is because there is no library in this episode. The Ruby King character, her name is Valentine, is not found in Colonel Bantry's library, but on Larossier's pillow in his bed right next to him. Larossier is arrested for murder, leaving Lampion in charge for most of this investigation. And boy, is this awkward because Valentine is not a dancer, and the Majestic Hotel is not a hotel in this one. Valentine is a prostitute, and the Majestic is now the Bluebird Brothel. There is a lot of fun poked at Lampion being gay and having to deal with all these attractive women, including one scene where he tries to sleep with one of the prostitutes, but, can't. And for an adaptation that drastically changed the setting and other features, you can see all the parts of the body in the library in this episode. It's all there. And the novel is a satire of mystery novels, and this episode plays with that quite a bit by having this like ridiculous over the top story and setting. It had all the characters like running around and just being ridiculous. It was a really good episode. I understand some people, may not enjoy this episode. It's a very adult episode with suggestive themes, but that didn't particularly bother me. This is not like an adult episode. It's more, adulty, but you should be fine with it if you have, even if you have, some concerns about watching this type of content. I understand that, but I found this episode really enjoyable from start to finish. Episode 10 is called Un meurtre en sommeil, Sleeping Murder, and we have a very different setup to this one. The Gwenda character is single and is now named Sasha, and in the opening scene, she escapes from a mental institution and winds up buying the same house where this Helen woman was murdered. She vaguely remembers it, and again, it appears this was an accident, which seems very strange because during the opening sequence, it does seem as if Sasha is deliberately purchasing this house, which would have made a lot more sense. And there are a lot of new characters in this episode, and they do have like parallels, but not as strong equivalents as other episodes do. And there are way more murders in this one than in the book, with Sasha being the prime suspect. Overall, I think the story is much more cohesive and sensical than the book. I think the book is very scattered at times, and this episode isn't. Interestingly, we do get a lot of the same events happening, but in like at a completely different order, which again I think is for the better, and comes to make the episode more sensical. They dispense with like all that Duchess of Malfi stuff, which is probably for the best, as that is a huge spoiler if you know that play. And there's also a heavy focus on the psychology in this one, especially in terms of like psychoanalysis and treatment, which you can imagine in 1930s rural France, psychoanalysis treatment was terrifying. And there's also a subplot where the police department hires this woman to talk to the inspectors about psychology, and naturally Larossier falls for her. But overall, this was a great episode. I enjoyed it much more than I enjoyed the book. I do think the Joan Hickson adaptation of Sleeping Murder is also much better than the book. I won't say too much about the other one, but this is, for whatever reason, is a book that adapts much better than it is when you read it. And episode 11, the final episode of season 1, is called Le Couteau sur le Nuque, the knife in the neck, or as we know it, Lord Edgware dies. And this is another episode that takes like all the elements of the original novel and uses them in a completely different way. The plot of this episode bears really no resemblance to the original novel, but yet all the elements of the novel are still there. It's really fascinating how the show pulled this off. The action takes place largely in the theater, where Larossier has fallen smitten with the Jane Wilkinson parallel, because of course he does, and this is an entire separate set of murders presented in the form of an inverted mystery, so we see who did it from the start. although there are other murders where we don't see the killer, which was a pretty big tell. These were two separate killers at large. The main murder plot remains the same, but it is used in a different manner, and I would argue better. I saw right through the trick the first time I read this novel, and I think this adaptation does a better job of hiding it. There's no letter in this one, and that makes sense. Christie wrote her tricks and clues in English, so any clue regarding wordplay, names, letters, etc. simply don't work in other language. And I am curious to know how these work out in translations of the books, but anyway, I thought this was another great episode. Larossier's daughter Juliette returns, although she's played by a different actress for some reason. I did find the ending reveal a little overdramatic and cheesy, but it didn't detract from the episode, and actually did fit in with the tone of the series, and specifically with this episode. And the final thing I will talk about in this video is the miniseries Petits Meurtres en Famille, or Little Murders in the Family, with the English title of Agatha Christie's Family Murder Party, which actually aired before season 1 and had the same lead actors and characters, although it is not considered part of the same series. This is a 4-part adaptation of Hercule Poirot's Christmas, which you may remember is my personal favorite Christie novel. Although this adaptation is not set at Christmas, it takes place at Simeon Lee parallel Simon Letoscu, his 70th birthday party, which doesn't matter for plot purposes, but it is strange that the miniseries is set in late November, early December, and aired around the same time. Why not just make this a Christmas special? But anyway, everyone is gathered for the birthday party, including the Stephen Farr character, who is named Eloi, and he is a doctor, not from South Africa. We are in France still, so he is from the French colony of Côte d'Ivoire. He is black, and that gets mentioned a lot, though quite frankly a little less often than I was expecting, to be honest. The total runtime for this miniseries is over 6 hours, so the plot is expanded considerably, and for the better, I would argue. The characters are so much more vibrant than in the book. We are shown basically a complete story for every single character in this adaptation, and there are a lot of characters. David and Hilda are once again cut, which is the second time they've been chopped out of an adaptation. A lot of the David mommy issue stuff is given to the Harry character. There are a lot more servants in this one, and they are all given a storyline. The Alfred and Lydia parallels have a daughter. Simon Letoscu's sister shows up at one point, and we are told from the start, and this is a spoiler for the book, so if you don't want that ruined, skip ahead a bit, but the Pilar character, whose name is Inez here, is not the real Pilar. I think this is done to avoid the weird semi-incest stuff from the book where she's attracted to her uncles, because we're actually also told that Eloi is Simon Letoscu's son much earlier than we are in the book. And, the incest stuff still gets brought up a bit with Eloi, but at least the viewer isn't grossed out by this. There's a new plot going on discussing whether or not Simon Letoscu's wife committed suicide or if he murdered her by pushing her out a window. There are a lot of romantic subplots. Everyone is pretty much cheating on their partners with someone else in this. There's a lot of sex and romance going on. Everyone is also either a victim of murder or an attempted murder at some point in this miniseries. It's almost comical how many people have attempts or accidents on their lives. The murder mechanics are largely the same, but some of the more questionable aspects from the novel were improved upon, mainly the scream, and if you read the book, you know what I'm talking about. The book has an attempt on Pilar's life, and that is retained here, but it is on Alix, the other granddaughter, and is used much differently and much better. All of these changes, they're really expansions of plot, of character, are good. They are very much in line with the book's spirit and atmosphere. It feels like very much a continuation and an expansion of the book. And that made me think that this format of 4 90-minute episodes is probably the ideal format to adapt a Christie novel. This series did so much good. I'm going to come out and say it, but this miniseries is a top 10 adaptation of Christie. It was fantastic. I know Christie's grandson, Matthew Pritchard, called this the best adaptation ever of a Christie novel. I'm not sure I'd go that far off. I've held off on making a top 10 Christie adaptations videos. I did the worst, but I held off on the best because I'm just like overwhelmed with options, and this added yet another wrench into the list. What prevents me from calling this the very best is that the crime is solved via the supernatural, where Simon's sister has a Ouija board and it tells Lampion what to look for. That is extremely unsatisfying and knocks it quite a bit. I suspect this would wind up at like 6th or 7th best adaptation of all time, just because of that alone. And we're not actually with Larossier and Lampion for like the first 2.5 episodes. We're with the other characters, and that is an interesting choice, and I think it paid off. And the solution here is good too. It is a proper summation gathering, and I was like totally gripped. One of my favorite little moments of the novel is Poirot complaining about the lack of central heating, and that is retained in this adaptation where the coal company is on strike, so the house is freezing cold. It reminded me a lot of the snow-stuck train in Murder on the Orient Express, where it just gets progressively colder as time goes on. I was also baffled as to like what the solution would be, because throughout season 1 I could kind of like tell if they changed the solution or not. In Petits Meurtres en Famille, I couldn't tell at all, and there were lines of dialogue lifted right from the book, which is unusual for this series, but I could not tell in which direction this was going. I absolutely adore this miniseries, and I cannot recommend it enough. It is a solid A+. And that is it for this video. Let me know what you think of Season 1 of Les Petits Meurtres d'Agatha Christie and Petits Meurtres en Famille in the comments below. I look forward to watching Season 2 and 3, and I will review those when I get to them. I'm taking a little break from binging Christie for a bit, but I will return. Next week, I have 6 more theories, unanswered questions, whatever, about Agatha Christie novels to discuss. These are quite popular videos. I know they get a lot of attention, a lot of discussion going on. And these are, of course, conspiracy theories, unanswered questions, what have you, about Christie novels that may not have been explained in the text. So stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files.